Hey, Daniel. Hey, John. How are you all?
Hey.
Thanks for the
Hi.
time.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to set this up just to help me out, help me to understand how we can adjust milestone cleanup where there is not as much impact to the say-do ratio. I tried my best to pull together some examples. I was still a little confused on specific examples where there's issues that are rescheduled that are not included in the say-do ratio. And my sincere apologies if I'm overlooking things. There's just been a lot going on in life, and I'm just trying to make sure I get this right here. Chun, thanks for the reply earlier. I see that you say it's possible that changes improve the accuracy. Daniel, do you have any examples where just like an issue that went through the reschedule and cleanup that didn't show up in the say-do ratio?
We did have one instance that the release management team had that there was just an error in it somewhere that Lily was able to clean up. Thank you, Lily. I think Lily probably has a better explanation of what actually happened there. It's not really actually my core concern. Happy to talk about that more, but yeah, Lily has a good example, I think.
Let me just clarify a little bit when this issue came up. At that time, what was the problem is the bot starts to migrate the unfinished issues on the 19th of each month. Mm-hmm. But our query actually closes on the 17th. Then some unfinished issues are actually not counted correctly because there is an 18th in the middle. So the issues are still tagged as previous release. So they are not done.
Yeah, but sorry, Chan, didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, so that's the issue. They are not done on the 18th, but they are not counted towards next release because the query actually starts from the 18th while the issue is still tagged as a previous release. So these issues on the 18th, they're still open while tagged as for the previous release. They're not counted in either previous release or upcoming release.
Yeah, and the overall what we're doing right now, I think the milestone bot cleanup makes sense to me, but when we start adding say-do, it doesn't. I think say-do is great, and being able to call out when we have things that are going to make it into some type of release. I actually had a full response before you that I had not pressed send on, so I'm really sorry about that because I tried to write all this down and I got distracted. I apologize. But yeah, so I agree with what John's saying. That's 100%. I don't mean anything I say is not meant to correct that or adjust that. But in general, we have a monthly cadence for releasing. That monthly cadence is appropriate for self-managed customers, and that's where a lot of our profit comes from. So it certainly matters, and we certainly need to be able to communicate it. So that's a good thing that we have. But our release cadence for .com is daily. They're effectively once a day these days, right? So our cadence for releases there is every day. And so what I find interesting about the current setup is the misdeliverable bot, that triage, the cleanup bot for the end of a milestone, totally makes sense on behalf of the self-managed customers and .com, but the say-do doesn't make sense if we're considering anything for .com after the 18th that's actually deployed and released, because it should be up to the 21st, I suppose, that something could be in and completed. And I think the bigger issue here is all of these dates, cutoff ranges and stuff that we have, they're just a non-deterministic way to figure out what we put in a release and deliver to .com or self-managed releases, right? And so we're trying to make them reflect what's actually in there, but the reality is the only way we really know, because we don't know whether the build they did didn't work, and so they reverted back to the previous one. This happens. It was actually doing a deterministic method of identifying what's actually in a release. My sense was if we aligned the bot with, or if we, I think taking the say-do ratio calculation and using the misdeliverable labels means we only have to solve this problem in one place. But it does mean that we still miss that the discrepancy between when we need something in a release for it to be delivered to self-managed customers and when we actually would need something in a release to be out on.com. And so that's where that big weird gap is for me. And so I was kind of trying to suggest ways we might try and solve that problem. And I think as our say-do moves towards becoming a KPI, which hopefully it will be, because I think it's an awesome metric and I love that we did it. Thank you, Lily, for all your hard work on that. This will become more of a problem because people will be like, well, my say-do says this, but I actually released these things 2 days later. It went to .com and we weren't really even targeting self-managed customers for that. And so that's kind of my summary. So I feel like in the case of how we might solve it, I don't have the answers. But because there's a discrepancy between the labeling as it appears on issues, when those labels are evaluated and added from when our say-do ratio is actually calculated and how we're calculating a say-do, it just means that people are going to be like, wait up, what's happening? It's confusing, and it's not really accurate necessarily.
Okay. Okay. So so kind of coming back to that comment, if the milestone reschedule, milestone cleanup automation is aligned to what is, I guess, where this MR is, like, is this MR in the release environment and is this MR in the GPRD environment? That would tell us that the MRs associated to an issue are in a release or deployed to GitLab.com. But what's hard to do when we reschedule issues is what assumption do we make with how many MRs? Because it's a one-to-many relationship in theory, and it could just be a mention. Like someone could just say, oh, this is related to this issue, and there's not a clear way to pull that apart.
So the release post process describes what engineering managers are expected to do to determine whether an issue actually made it in. And so that's documented. Sorry, Chang, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to highlight, Kyle, it's not MR. The say-do ratio is again issues.
Right. Yeah, so when an issue gets a label, and the reason I think we were actually saying this similar things from different directions there, Chan, so thank you for that. But it's because we have an issue with potentially several MRs associated with it, and we want to figure out which release they were in and whether that release was actually released. What ends up happening is for a release post, which is an associated process, is a documented step to go through each MR with the current milestone to determine whether that MR was actually in production or in verification stage. I kind of haven't solidified that in my head because I was reading that the other day. Figure out if all of them on prior milestones and the current milestone are actually in production, then that issue is considered to be released and not a misdeliverable from the release post perspective. And then how that aligns with, I think what you were saying, Chun, was there is a bit of a mismatch here with how we're considering the releases, because you could have 50 MRs and there could be one missing and it still doesn't end up in production. It's not considered released. Depending on the product manager, sometimes the product manager will say, oh, okay, yeah, we could just palm that off the next time. Let's hand it off, and that's okay.
Yeah, but the say-do ratio report really only looks at the issues. So if the issue is still staying with the previous release, it's still tied to the previous release. And also, like I said, if the issue is still open on 18th, it doesn't count to the previous release. It doesn't count towards the next release. It's just missing. This data point is missing in all reports.
Yeah, so I think we need to look into that gap. So Lily, I'm typing up comments on the issue as we're going along. I think that's a gap that we need to look into, because that was unclear to me. So I wasn't necessarily looking for issues that were open on the 18th and what milestone they're in. I was really looking at issues that went through the transition to see, are they included in the say-do ratio? So my apologies for the misunderstanding there. I'm going to make
I
sure.
think, so Chan, if you could just provide a little bit more clarification. I think I'm a little bit confused. So on the 18th, if it was still in that previous milestone, it still count as the previous milestone as say, but if it's open on the 18th, it wouldn't count towards the due for that previous milestone. On the 18th, say it doesn't reschedule yet, it wouldn't count towards the next milestone, but once the bot reschedules it to the next milestone, it should count as say. And then whether or not that issue closes during that iteration time period, it would either count as do or do not. But it should be counted towards the previous milestone if it was still there, even if it's open on 18th.
Let me sort out. I think I was not quite right at that time because right now I think we, you did some iterations there already. We are using the workflow labels now, workflow verification, workflow production. So those labels will help, but that requires extra steps. So that's an operational issue concern. I think at that time, the issue is still tagged for the previous release. Oh, I know what happened. The issue, no, the issue is still tagged with a previous release, and it still stayed open on the 18th. I don't know. You check my comment there in the example. I think there were cases it's not counted as say or do.
Say, so in the Slack thread, I think when I was doing some investigation, there were 3 of them that I looked at. One of them was actually counted as say, and then the other 2 actually weren't counted, which is what Kyle was finding too, was that they weren't counted because they weren't a part of product. So those issues weren't counted as issues because they lived in a project outside of the product list, like the is part of product list, and that's why they weren't counted for say. So it didn't had anything to do with the dates particularly, but more so it just didn't live under there is part of product. That's why they weren't getting counted.
Okay, I'm sorry. This has been a long time ago, so I don't recall exactly what happened at that time. But what I discovered is basically the 18th is a problem. The 18th, that day introduces some anomaly here.
I can still try to identify issues that meet that criteria in SciSense, or Lily, like you or I, someone can, and then we can try to bring those up. I think it's worth looking into because I let this sit for too long, where this is something that you identified that we never came back and said, here's an example that kind of fits this criteria. This is what happened from a say-do ratio perspective. This is what happened from a milestone cleanup perspective.
Yeah.
I can take that on. Again, this fell off my radar, and my apologies for that.
And I think from a query perspective, just generally speaking about how I've built the logic, basically if you were looking on the 18th of the month and something wasn't counted, the reason why it wouldn't be counted would be either because it wasn't part of product, or the bot had yet to reschedule it and it still remained in the previous milestone. Or perhaps it was in the current milestone, but didn't have a deliverable label applied to it. So those are kind of the 3 scenarios that off the top of my head, why it wouldn't be included on the 18th.
Sorry, Lily, can I interject? When you say wasn't included in product, what does that mean?
There's this is part of, and Kyle can probably better explain this, but there's a list of is part of product projects. And if an issue doesn't, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I know what that is. So am I incorrect in saying that, am I correct in saying that our say-do ratio is updated constantly even after the 18th? So if I look at my team's performance on the 18th, any one of my teams, and I see it on the, call it the 17th, the 18th is not important for this argument, for the point I'm making. On the 17th, if I look at it, it says 60% or whatever. And then I go to the 20th. If they've completed and closed out issues that are now in production on the 19th, will I have a better say-do?
Your say metric or the number that were listed as say should still be the same, but in addition to due as well, I think if they've closed anything from the 17th, which is the cutoff, to the 20th, then we wouldn't count that as due.
Right.
Unless it had the workflow verification or production labels applied before the 17th, and then they closed it from the 17th to the 20th.
Right.
So the say-do ratio, I would say, wouldn't be improved for that previous milestone that you were kind of reviewing.
Right. So in that case, I think, Chun, maybe this is wrong, but this is kind of how I interpreted your comments, although I think you gave a more specific example. What happens at that point is that is true only for self-managed customers.
Yes. Well,
It's only
yeah.
anyone.com, and that is actually, we have, as I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone, we have a bunch of really important customers on .com. Super not true for them, because that'll be released the 20th and it's out. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
You're right.
You're correct. You're correct. So my concern is primarily about the self-managed releases, because let's say the ratio is tied to the release cycle. So my primary concern is about self-managed, and I do think Lily did more iterations there, and adding, using those two labels, workflow, those two labels solved the problem I had largely. It's just the team members have to remember to apply those two labels. That's execution issue. But I do think those two labels will solve my initial problem.
Yeah, and I think my concerns were never, well, I mean, they're related, but they're slightly different in the sense that, like, I think, and I tried to make this point maybe poorly if no one kind of understood what I was getting at. But the point I was trying to get at there was, if we only care about self-managed releases, and again, I know a heap of our profit/income comes from that, so we should super care about them, then the say-do as it is right now is perfect, no problem. But as soon as we start considering, well, the labels of missed deliverables get run on the 22nd, or I forget, Kyle, depends on a few different things, but
Yeah.
it's called that 22nd because best case scenario, they'll get a missed deliverable at that point if they're not closed. But in fact, from the say-do ratios perspective, they were missed deliverables on the 18th. And so there is a gap there in how we're communicating and reporting. And I think to sort of reiterate a little, my main argument here is, if we're going to use this for a KPI, that gap is problematic. And I think a different approach, completely just to maybe think about it, is we could have a separate label for missed self-managed deliverable and missed .com deliverable, and that would completely identify where the discrepancy is that I'm trying to call out in this conversation, which would say from the 18th, it would get a missed deliverable instantly. There'd be another bot that would run. It would add a missed self-managed deliverable. Boop, they would get them all. And then anything that didn't get production or verification by the 20th, 22nd, or whatever it is, would get a missed .com or missed SaaS or whatever we're calling it deliverable. Is that
So
maybe?
Then just to clarify, so I think what you're questioning is more of the numerator, the due portion of it. And so right now, like you mentioned, it works as, if it's closed or has any of those two labels, we count it as do or do not. But you're suggesting we can't do that because of the self-managed releases. And so in that case, you would recommend, instead of using those labels and some sort of date, it would just be using the missed deliverable label. So if anything had a missed deliverable label or not, we'd either count that as do or do not. So that's like the other side of it, I think. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's one approach I think we could take for sure. And I'm not saying we do this, but I'm really trying to just explain the situation. And I think the thing, I'm just looking at the time, but I think what the other thing that this brings up for me is that a lot of teams are trying to have more iterative processes that aren't just purely focused on a monthly cadence. And that's actually been encouraged at some level. And those people are adding deliverable, 2 weeks into something that they wouldn't have been in the say. So for those teams, if it's calculated just at the start of the milestone, then those teams are kind of taking a ding for not having put deliverable on right up front. And so there's a couple of ways. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to just add there that, so if they added a deliverable label like 2 weeks into the iteration, it still be counted as stay. So if at any point during the 18th of the month through the 17th of the next month, at first we did it where it was beginning of the month, then we realized, oh no, a lot of teams work Kanban style. So we decided if it was in the milestone and had a deliverable label at some point during the milestone iteration period, then we'd be like, okay, that's a stay.
Okay, that's my misunderstanding. Thank you. So yeah, the few options I proposed were you could have separate labeling for self-managed in .com. I'm not saying we want that. We already have 1 million labels, and so that's not ideal from that perspective. The other alternative would be to have the, as you just mentioned, Lily, have the say-do ratio based purely off the labeling. If the say-do was based purely off the labeling, it would be consistent in the issue what was happening with that issue, right? So when we looked at that, that would be our single source of truth, and we would know if it had a misdeliverable label, that would be reflected in the say-do ratio. The issue that brings up is the bot runs on the 21st or 22nd or whatever it is based on whatever cadence it's running on. And then the say-do is not going to see any of that stuff until after the 22nd because it wouldn't have run by then. And so I think another alternative we could consider is actually running that bot on the 17th or 18th as well. And so it would be updated at that point, and then we could make some assumptions about it having, maybe it runs twice, 17th and 21st or 18th and 22nd. And at that point we could run the say-do. It would appear to be working as it is now. It would reflect whether something was missed from a self-managed perspective, and that it would also then just be updated at the end of the month as well, or it could be updated on an ongoing basis.
I think if that were the case and there weren't any other implications, that would be best from a query perspective. And just like you mentioned, there would be a gap in reporting just because we now would have to be explaining self-managed release say-dos versus like release management say-dos, which is a bit complicated from a query perspective. But I will say if there are implications, then we definitely could break it out to see it both. But
what do you think, Kyle? What do you think is the lowest impact here? Is I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you have anyone here, right? But.
Yeah, so definitely don't have all the answers. I think moving it earlier, the earlier iterations of having this run earlier than what it is now were not created a lot of confusion on the product side. That happened right as I joined. So to be completely honest, I'm not like fully versed in the impacts that happen. I can look into it a little bit closer. I still like the idea, I guess, of using missed deliverable, running it on the 22nd, using missed deliverable as the single source of truth for the due as well, and then just building that logic based off of where, I'll say adjusting the logic from what it currently is. I don't know what that looks like, but just making it a little bit more accurate than it's an open issue. You know, right now that's essentially what it is.
Yeah, and I think the confusion would be really plain to people who are like, well, the milestone ends on this date. Why would we be getting this deliverable now? And so that's why I was saying that the separate labeling for self-managed in .com would be a way to do that, but I think it's a pretty awful way to do it. I'm hoping there's a better way. But again, it's really just calling out, we have 2 dates we care about right now. And the reason we have 2 dates is we actually have 2 separate release cadences for our product, depending on whether we're self-managed or whether we're .com. And so the way we square those can be just like at the top of the thing, hey, anything you merge at the top of the say-do dashboard really could be anything you merge or get in production after this date won't be reflected here, but the labeling will be accurate by the end of the milestone. And so we could say that too. That might just be the simplest thing to call out here rather than running off and changing things around. But part of the reason, Kyle, I was suggesting running that bot twice would be so that those things are updated at 2 separate times that reflect our current release, best case release cadence, right?
Right.
And I don't know if that's possible or bad or whatever, but that would be a way to say, hey, this is a shorthand to say we're going to run it on the 18th as well as the 22nd. And then on the 18th, at least it represents what's in the say-do and what's true for self-managed customers, which I think is important.
Yeah, we'd have to pull apart because right now, actually rescheduling the issues happens when the missed deliverable labels are applied. So we wouldn't want to apply missed deliverable, move it to the next release, and then re-look at everything. You know,
but then you just separate out the labeling and from the rescheduling, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess to me that makes sense. Like if we're running it twice, then we don't want to move something. Like we almost want to re-update everything that was labeled.
Okay, so we're right. Go ahead, Kyle, sorry.
Yeah, so I was gonna say we're at time. I think what would help me is looking at that process. You talked about the release post process describes what exactly engineering managers do. I'm not super familiar with that. So if you could point me to that, I'll do some research to look into this. it seems like the data exceptions are likely in a better state than it was before. So I didn't get anything that we need to look at. But from my perspective, we need to change this policy to help make sure that we have one consistent way of determining what is done within a milestone. And using labels seems to be the way to improve that. And right now our labeling hygiene doesn't allow us to say, what did we accomplish from a deliverable perspective within within a milestone. Am I right in all of that, or am I way off on something? So I will research that process that, Dan, if you can send that over, I'll research that and see how we can tweak the rescheduling policy and come up with a better proposal. By next week, I'll touch base in the issue async, mention this whole group, and if we need to get back together, we can. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I won't be updating the say-do ratio as of right now until we meet again. I saw a note, Dan, that you mentioned adding weights, so I could definitely do that async, and then I think there's an issue for that. So I'll add that. I had the same concerns you had at the bottom of the issue about teams not using weights consistently and stuff like that, but I think as an extra column and not updating the logic is going to be totally fine.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
And just to reconfirm that the latest report, say-do ratio report, by using looking at the workflow verification and the workflow production labels, that solves at least 95% of the issues I have seen for my teams. So
that's
I think
good.
So that should be a good solution for us in practice.
There's their definitions of the say-do is also at the top of the dashboard, and so if we make changes, we can call it out there. But as of right now, it has those notions about those two labels. So
yeah, notice that.
Okay, I will. I typed notes in the issue along here. I'm going to edit these, add it. I recorded this. I can upload it to Unfiltered and post it on the issue as well. But the main next step is on me. And I, again, just want to reiterate my apologies for the slipping. We'll get something figured out. Let us know if this is we need to get something figured out before it becomes a KPI, because holding everybody to a KPI where the logic isn't as, the logic doesn't support it is not something we should be doing. So yeah, that's it for me. Anything else that anyone would like to bring up or share?
Thank you.
Great. I appreciate the time. Thank you all very much.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.